Tol-in-Gaurhoth began as the island of Tol-Sirion, where the elf lord Finrod Felagund had built a watchtower to guard the pass of Sirion against the forces of Morgoth. Sauron, Morgoth's most capable servant, took the island and transformed it into a fortress of dread, renaming it Tol-in-Gaurhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. He raised a new bridge across the river and filled the tower with prisoners and wolves, making the place a sentinel of terror on the northern frontier of Beleriand. Beren, a mortal man of the House of Beor, came to the island seeking a Silmaril, accompanied by Finrod Felagund and 10 companions disguised as orcs. Sauron saw through their disguise and challenged Finrod to a contest of songs of power, each trying to discover the other's identity and purpose. Sauron sang of the treachery of Felagund's own kin, the sons of Fëanor, and of the oath that drove them, and Finrod's song faltered. Sauron stripped them of their disguises and cast Beren and Finrod into a deep pit within the tower, leaving the companions in darkness. One by one, Sauron sent a werewolf down into the prison to devour the captives, and one by one the companions died until only Beren and Finrod remained. When the final wolf came for Beren, Finrod broke his chains and threw himself on the beast, killing it with his bare hands and his last strength, and so died protecting Beren. Luthien, daughter of Thingol and Melian, came to the bridge of Tol-in-Gaurhoth with the great hound Huan, and Huan slew every wolf Sauron sent forth, until Sauron himself took wolf form and descended to meet the hound at the gate. Huan defeated Sauron, and Luthien demanded the keys of the tower, and Sauron yielded them. Luthien sang, and the tower fell, and the island was cleansed, and Beren was freed from the pit where Finrod had died. Annatar came to the western shores of Middle-earth in the early Second Age, wearing a fair form and calling himself the Lord of Gifts. He offered knowledge and craft to the elves, presenting himself as a teacher who could help them make Middle-earth as beautiful as the undying lands. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor in Lindon, refused him entry and distrusted him, and Elrond, who served Gil-galad, shared that distrust. Annatar passed eastward and came to Eregion, where the Gwathi Myrdain, the jewel-smiths of the Noldor, dwelt under the leadership of Celebrimbor, son of Curufin and grandson of Fëanor. The smiths of Eregion welcomed Annatar, for they desired to increase their skill and to make things of beauty and endurance that would preserve the lands they loved from decay. Annatar taught them ring lore, the making of rings of power, and the smiths learned from him and made many rings of varying kinds over long years. Celebrimbor himself forged the 3 rings, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, using the knowledge that had come through Annatar's teaching, though Annatar never touched the 3 or had a hand in their making. The 3 were made to preserve, to heal, and to understand, and they carried no taint of Annatar's direct craft, but they were still bound to the law he had taught, and that law carried his hidden purpose. Annatar concealed his identity, for he was Sauron, the servant of Morgoth, and his purpose was to bring the elves under his domination through the rings they made with his guidance. He spent centuries in Eregion, building trust and sharing knowledge, until the smiths had learned enough to make rings of great power, and the time came for Sauron to forge a single ring to rule them. Eregion stood as the chief elven settlement of the Second Age in the lands east of the Misty Mountains, and it became the place where Sauron's long deception bore its fruit. The rings of power were made there by the Gwathi Myrdain over many years, and around the year 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron forged the One Ring in the fires of Orodruin, Mount Doom, in the heart of Mordor. When Sauron put on the One Ring, the elves who wore the 3 felt his intent and understood that they had been betrayed, and they removed their rings and hid them. Celebrimbor had already given the 3 to others for safekeeping, and Sauron could not find them. Sauron demanded the surrender of all the rings, and when the elves refused, he made war on Eregion with a great army out of Mordor. The war began in the year 1693 of the Second Age, and Sauron's forces swept through the eastern lands toward Eregion. Celebrimbor stood against Sauron in the defense of Eregion, and the smiths fought, but Sauron's army was vast, and the elven defenders were overwhelmed. Eregion was sacked in the year 1697, and Celebrimbor was captured alive. Sauron tortured Celebrimbor to learn the locations of all the rings of power, and Celebrimbor revealed where the 7 and the 9 were kept, but he would not reveal where the 3 had been sent. Sauron took the Seven and the Nine by force, and Celebrimbor died under torment, and Sauron had his body strung up on a pole and carried before Sauron's army as a banner as the forces advanced toward the west. Elrond, who had come from Lindon with a force to aid Eregion, gathered the survivors and led them northward into the valley of Imladris, Rivendell, where he established a refuge that endured for the rest of the age. Sauron's army pressed westward, and the war continued, but the sack of Eregion had already accomplished what Sauron intended. The craft of the elven smiths was broken, their leader was dead, and the rings were in Sauron's hands or hidden beyond his reach. The Nine. Rings of power were given by Sauron to mortal men, and through them he made his most enduring servants. The men who received the Nine were great among their kind, some warriors and some kings or chieftains, and the rings gave them wealth and glory and long life beyond the span of ordinary men. The rings increased their strength and their authority, and for a time they flourished and built strongholds and ruled wide lands. The rings also extended their lives far beyond what was natural for men, and this proved to be the means of their enslavement, for men were not meant to live indefinitely, and the stretching of their lives became a stretching into shadow. Over centuries, each bearer of a Nine Ring faded from the visible world, passing into a state where they existed in the Wraith world, visible to others only as dark shapes and felt as terror. They became the Nazgûl, the Ring-Wraiths, bound to Sauron through the rings he had given them and through the One Ring that ruled them. The chief of the Nine was the Witch King of Angmar, and he became Sauron's most powerful and feared servant, leading armies and destroying kingdoms across centuries of the Third Age. The identities of most of the Nine are not recorded in the histories of Middle-earth, and the names they bore before they became ring-wraiths are lost. They wore rings that enslaved them, and they served Sauron without rest, and their wills were bent to his, and they moved through the world as instruments of his purpose. The Nine could not die in the ordinary manner of men, and they could not willingly resist the command of Sauron while he held the One Ring, or while its power endured. They were living, men made into immortal slaves, and their existence was the consequence of the rings that had first promised them everything they desired. Numenor was the great island kingdom of men in the Second Age, given to the Edain by the Valar as a reward for their aid against Morgoth in the War of Wrath. The Númenorians became the most powerful nation of men in Middle-earth, and their ships sailed to every shore, and their wealth and knowledge grew for centuries. Sauron, after the war with the Elves and the sack of Eregion, extended his power into the eastern and southern lands of Middle-earth, and the Númenorians began to establish colonies along the western coasts. In the year 3262 of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn, king of Numenor, landed a great army at Umbar and marched on Mordor, and Sauron's forces deserted him rather than face the Númenorian host. Sauron humbled himself and came before Ar-Pharazôn as a captive, and he was taken back to Numenor in chains, though the chains were part of his design. Once in Numenor, Sauron used his cunning to rise from prisoner to the king's chief counselor, and he persuaded Ar-Pharazôn that the Valar had deceived the Númenorians by withholding immortality from them. Sauron spoke of Melkor, the true Lord of Arda, in his telling, and he convinced Ar-Pharazôn to worship Melkor in a temple built for that purpose. The worship of Melkor involved human sacrifice, and the faithful, those Númenorians who remained loyal to the Valar and the old ways, were persecuted and killed and used as offerings. Sauron persuaded Ar-Pharazôn to cut down Nimloth, the White Tree of Numenor, which had been a gift from the elves and a symbol of the island's connection to the Eldar and the Valar. Isildur, son of Elendil, went in disguise to the court of Armenelos and took a fruit from Nimloth before the tree was destroyed, and he was wounded by the guards but escaped with the fruit, and from it a sapling grew. Ar-Pharazôn, now old and fearing death, listened to Sauron's counsel to sail against Aman, the Undying Lands, and seize immortality by force from the Valar. Ar-Pharazôn built the great armament, the largest fleet ever assembled, and in the year 3319 of the Second Age, he sailed westward toward Aman with a host of ships and soldiers. The Valar laid down their guardianship and called upon Eru Ilúvatar, and Eru opened the sea and the earth, and Numenor sank beneath the waves in a single night, and the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was swallowed by the sea. Sauron's body was destroyed in the downfall, and his spirit rose and fled eastward to Middle-earth, carried by the wind back to Mordor. The destruction of his body cost Sauron the ability to take a fair form again, and from that time forward he could only appear as a dark and terrible lord. The faithful, led by Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion, had sailed east before the downfall, and they came to Middle-earth and founded the realms of Arnor and Gondor, carrying the fruit of Nimroth and the Palantiri, the seeing stones of Numenor. One Ring was forged by Sauron in the fires of Eregion, the volcano in the heart of Mordor that the elves called Mount Doom, and into it Sauron poured much of his own native power. The ring was made to dominate the other rings of power, to bring the elves and the bearers of the Seven and the Nine under Sauron's will, and through them to control the peoples of Middle-earth. The forging of the One Ring completed Sauron's plan for the rings, and when he put it on, the elves felt his intent and removed their own rings, and Sauron's attempt to control them directly failed. The ring contained so much of Sauron's power that it bound his existence to the ring itself, and while the ring endured, Sauron could not be wholly destroyed, and if the ring were destroyed, Sauron would be reduced to a powerless spirit. Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower of Mordor, was built in the same era as the forging of the ring, and its foundations were tied to the power of the ring, so that the tower could not be wholly destroyed while the ring survived. After the downfall of Numenor, Sauron returned to Mordor and took up the ring again, and gathered his strength, and the Dark Tower rose once more. The last alliance of elves and men was formed by Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, and Elendil, King of Arnor and Gondor, and they marched against Sauron with a great host of elves and men. The army of the last alliance besieged Barad-dûr for 7 years, and in the final assault on the fortress, Sauron came forth and fought Gil-galad and Elendil on the slopes of Eregion. Gil-galad was killed by the heat of Sauron's hand, and Elendil fell beneath Sauron's mace, and Nazgûl, Elendil's sword, broke beneath him as he died. Isildur, son of Elendil, took up the broken hilt of Nazgûl and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, and Sauron's body was destroyed and his spirit fled. Isildur refused to destroy the ring, claiming it as Wergild for his father and his brother Anarion, and he kept it, and the ring survived. Because the ring endured, Sauron's spirit endured, and over long centuries of the Third Age he gathered strength again and returned, and the ring waited for a new bearer to carry it back to its master or to its destruction. Angmar arose in the north of Middle-earth around the year 1300 of the Third Age, when the Witch King of the Nazgûl established a realm in the lands north of the Weather Hills. The Witch King was the chief of the 9 ring-wraiths, and he acted as a proxy for Sauron's renewed power, though Sauron did not physically lead Angmar's wars. The northern kingdom of Arnor had been divided into 3 smaller realms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur, and the division weakened the Dúnedain of the north. Angmar made war on the northern kingdoms over centuries, attacking the divided Dúnedain and wearing down their strength through repeated assaults. The Witch King captured the tower of Amon-Sul, Weathertop, and the Palantir that had been kept there was lost. Cardolan was overrun, and its last prince fell in battle against the forces of Angmar. Rhudaur had already fallen under the control of Angmar's allies, and the men of that land who served the Witch King harried Arthedain from the east. Arthedain held out longest, but in the year 1974 of the Third Age, the Witch King's forces overran Fornost, the capital of Arthedain, and the last king of Arthedain, Avdui, fled northward into the winter. Avdui died in the year 1975, when his ship foundered in the ice of the Bay of Forochel, and the 2 Palantiri he carried were lost to the sea. A fleet from Gondor arrived in the north in 1975, and an army of Gondor joined with the remnant of the northern Dúnedain and the elves of Lindon under Glorfindel, and they defeated the Witch King's forces at the Battle of Fornost. The Witch King rode south from the battle, and Glorfindel pursued him, and the Witch King fled from the northern lands. Glorfindel spoke a prophecy after the battle, that the Witch King would not fall by the hand of man, and the prophecy held for centuries until the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Angmar was destroyed as a realm, but the damage to the northern Dúnedain was permanent, and Arnor never recovered, and the remnants of its people became the rangers who wandered the wild in the centuries that followed. Minas Morgul had been Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, founded by Isildur as a fortress on the eastern side of the mountains of Gondor, guarding the pass into Mordor from the west. The city was built in the early years of Gondor, and held one of the Palantiri, the seeing stones brought from Numenor by Elendil and his sons. The Nazgûl besieged Minas Ithil in the year 2000 of the Third Age, and the city fell in the year 2002 after a siege of 2 years. The Nazgûl captured the Palantir of Minas Ithil and took it to Sauron, and through that stone Sauron could see and could later manipulate what Denethor in Minas Tirith saw through the Palantir of Anorion. The city was renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Black Sorcery, and it became the Witch King's seat of power on the western border of Mordor. The valley of Imlad Morgul, in which the city stood, became a place of fear, and the bridge that crossed the stream at the city's gate was built in a white and terrible shape, and the water that flowed beneath it was poisonous. A corpse light glowed above Minas Morgul, a pale green light that shone from the tower and lit the valley with a sickly illumination. The road that led from Minas Morgul westward through Ithilien toward Osgiliath became the Morgul Road, and it was used by the armies of Mordor when they marched to war against Gondor. The garrison of Minas Morgul was drawn from the forces of Mordor, and the Witch King dwelt there and commanded the western front of Sauron's domain. When the War of the Ring began, the army of Minas Morgul marched out of the city and down the Morgul Road and crossed the Anduin at Osgiliath and advanced toward Minas Tirith, and the Witch King led that army to the Pelennor fields. Dol Guldur stood on the hill of Aemon Lank in the southern part of Greenwood the Great, and around the year 1000 of the Third Age, Sauron came there in secret and established himself in the old fortress on the hill. He was called the Necromancer, and his presence cast a shadow over the forest, and Greenwood began to be called Mirkwood as the darkness spread from Dol Guldur northward through the trees. The shadow brought fear to the woodland and changed the character of the forest, and the elves of the Sylvan realm under Thranduil retreated northward from the southern woods, where the darkness was strongest. The wise, the Istari, and the chief Eldar, who formed the White Council, became aware that a power had arisen in Dol Guldur, and they suspected it might be one of the Nazgûl or Sauron himself returned. Gandalf went to Dol Guldur in the year 2850 of the Third Age, and entered the fortress in secret, and there he found Thrain, father of Thorin Oakenshield, dying in a pit after long imprisonment. Thrain had been captured by Sauron's servants and brought to Dol Guldur, and the last of the 7 rings of the dwarves had been taken from him. Thrain gave Gandalf a map and a key before he died, and Gandalf carried them out and later gave them to Thorin, and from this came the quest to Erebor. Gandalf confirmed that the Necromancer was Sauron, and he urged the White Council to attack Dol Guldur. The White Council attacked Dol Guldur in the year 2941, and Sauron withdrew from the fortress, but the withdrawal was planned, for Sauron had already prepared his return to Mordor. Sauron's servants reoccupied Dol Guldur after his departure, and the fortress remained a stronghold of Mordor in the north throughout the War of the Ring, and from it armies marched against Lorien and Thranduil's realm. The hunt for the ring began inside Barad-dûr in the year 3017 of the Third Age. Gollum had been captured by Sauron's servants and brought to the Dark Tower, where Sauron questioned him about the ring that he had possessed for centuries. Tolkien does not describe the methods used in that questioning, but he records its result. Under torment, Gollum gave up 2 words, Shire and Baggins. To Sauron they were enough. He understood that the ring had passed out of the Misty Mountains into the western lands, and that a hobbit named Baggins had carried it. A single prisoner, broken into speaking 2 names, became the source of the intelligence that set the last war in motion. Sauron then turned information into pursuit. In 3018 he sent the 9 Nazgûl north from Mordor and Minas Morgul to find the Shire and its ring-bearer. The riders did not arrive as an army. They entered the ordinary world of hobbits. They questioned Hamfast Gamgee at Bag End, rode through Buckland at night, and broke into the house at Crick Hollow after Frodo had gone. Their search continued at Bree, where they learned that the hobbits had travelled with a ranger called Strider, and then eastward toward Weathertop. At every stage, Sauron made the small world around the ring feel exposed. A road, an inn, a familiar house, and a neighbour's answer could all become part of the hunt. At Weathertop, the Witch King attacked Frodo and drove a Morgul knife into his shoulder. The blade broke, leaving a fragment in the wound. Its danger was not simply death. If the fragment remained, Frodo would fade into a wraith under the command of the 9. Aragorn drove the riders off with fire, but he could not remove the danger. Frodo had to be carried to Rivendell, where Elrond removed the splinter. The pursuit continued to the ford of Bruinen. There the Nine entered the water to seize Frodo, and the flood released by Elrond and Gandalf swept them away. Their horses were drowned, and their visible forms were destroyed, though the Nazgûl themselves returned to Mordor. The riders had failed to take the ring, but their campaign showed the scale of Sauron's reach. A confession in Barad-dûr could become terror on the doorstep of the Shire, and a wound that marked Frodo for the rest of his life. The Palantiri gave Sauron another way to make an enemy destroy himself from within. Minas Ithil had possessed one of the seeing stones brought from Numenor, and after the Nazgûl captured the city and remade it as Minas Morgul, that stone came into Sauron's possession. Denethor, steward of Gondor, used the Palantir of Minas Tirith in secret. He was a powerful and disciplined mind, and Sauron did not simply place false pictures before him. Instead, Sauron controlled the encounter through the Ithil stone and showed Denethor true events selected for their effect. The vast mustering of Mordor, the defeat at Osgiliath, the strength of the enemy, and the apparent collapse of every hope of aid. That distinction made the attack more dangerous. Denethor saw real evidence, but never the whole field. He did not see the limits of Sauron's knowledge, the uncertainty in the enemy's plans, or the chances that still remained beyond the images chosen for him. By the siege of Minas Tirith, the steward had become convinced that resistance was futile. After Faramir returned gravely wounded, Denethor abandoned command, ordered a pyre prepared, and attempted to burn himself and his living son. Gandalf and Eregion prevented Faramir's death, but Denethor perished in the fire. Sauron had not needed to conquer Minas Tirith before the siege to weaken it. Through a captured Palantir, he had helped remove its leader at the moment Gondor most needed him. War of the Ring began in the year 3018 with the assault of Sauron's forces on Osgiliath, the ruined city on the Anduin that stood between Minas Morgul and Minas Tirith, and the attack was led by the forces of Minas Morgul under the Witch King. The attack on Osgiliath was Sauron's means of testing the strength of Gondor and of drawing out the defenders before the main assault on Minas Tirith, and the Gondorian garrison under Faramir was overwhelmed and forced to retreat westward across the river. In June of 3019, the full army of Mordor marched from Minas Morgul, led by the Witch King, and the host crossed the Anduin and moved toward the city of Minas Tirith. The siege of Minas Tirith began when the army of Mordor surrounded the city and broke its gates with a great battering ram called Grond, and the Witch King entered through the broken gate and confronted Gandalf at the gate. The riders of Rohan came to the Pelennor fields at dawn, and the charge of the Rohirrim broke the siege lines of Mordor, and the Witch King turned to meet them and was killed by Éowyn, a woman of Rohan, and Meriadoc Brandybuck, a hobbit, fulfilling the prophecy of Glorfindel that he would not fall by the hand of man. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields was one front of a war that Sauron waged across the breadth of the northwest of Middle-earth, and the assaults were coordinated to strike every remaining stronghold of the Free Peoples at once. 3 assaults were launched against Lórien from Dol Guldur, and the elves under Celeborn and Galadriel defended the borders of the Golden Wood, and the attacks were driven back, and after the fall of Sauron, the elves of Lórien marched on Dol Guldur and destroyed it. Attacks were also launched against Thranduil's realm in Mirkwood, and the elves of the woodland fought the forces of Dol Guldur in the north, and Thranduil held his borders and repelled the assaults. In the east, an army of Easterlings, men allied to Sauron, marched against the men of Dale and the dwarves of Erebor, and the Battle of Dale was fought at the gates of the Lonely Mountain. King Brand of Dale fell, and King Dain Ironfoot of Erebor fell defending Brand's body, and the men and dwarves retreated into Erebor and were besieged, and the siege was not lifted until news came of the fall of Sauron. Sauron's strategy was to apply simultaneous pressure across every region where his enemies could gather strength, so that no aid could be sent from one front to another, and the Free Peoples were stretched to their limits on every side. The final stroke of the war came when Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee reached Orodruin, and Frodo claimed the ring at the crack of doom, and Gollum seized the ring and fell into the fire, and the ring was destroyed on the 25th of March in the year 3019 of the Third Age. When the ring was destroyed, Barad-dûr collapsed, for its foundations were bound to the power of the ring, and the tower fell, and the dark gate of Mordor was broken. The Nazgûl, whose existence was bound to the ring, were consumed in the ruin of the mountain and the fall of the tower, and the Nine were ended. Sauron's spirit survived the destruction of the ring, but it was diminished to a shadow too weak to take shape or to act upon the world again, and it passed away into the void. The war had been fought on the Pelennor and before the Black Gate, and at the gates of Erebor, and in the woods of Lorien and Mirkwood, and the destruction of the ring broke the power that had driven every assault, and the realms of Sauron's enemies endured, diminished by the war, but free of the shadow that had covered the lands for so long.